detailed look of the history of psychiatry's bias against African Americans. It was William Tutman, Ph.D., co-founder of the Committee to Stop the Federal Violence Initiative, who said, to oppress a race and then label its reactions to the oppression as mental illness is not only morally wrong, it is criminal and a fraud. In 1797, the father of American psychiatry, Dr. Benjamin Rush, whose face still adorns the seal of the American Psychiatric Association, declared that blacks were black because they suffered a rare disease called negritude. As internationally renowned author and professor of psychiatry, Dr. Thomas Sales wrote in his book, The Manufacture of Madness, Rush did not believe that God created the African American black, nor that the African American is black by nature. Instead, he believed that negritude was a disease genetically passed on by African American ancestors, which he claimed suffered leprosy. Rush argued that African American, like lepers, had an insensitivity to pain compared to white people, and could endure surgical operations with no anesthesia, no drugs. This might explain why South African psychiatrists for decades administered electroconvulsive therapy to Africans without anesthesia, in some macabre belief that they do not feel pain like other human beings. Dr. Rush argued, and he was the most famous doctor of his time. He was the top of the food chain. He was number one. Personal President Washington, physician to President Washington. He argued that leprosy was inherited, a forerunner of today's eugenics movement. According to Dr. Sales, quote, Rush made the black a medically safe domestic, while at the same time called for his sexual segregation as a carrier of dreaded hereditary disease, unquote. And while Dr. Rush said that whites should not tyrannize over blacks, that blacks should not intermarry, for this could, quote, spread the disease. Instead, he recommended that psychiatrists should attempt to find a cure for this illness of being black. Rush argued that blacks did not know what was best for themselves, and therefore medically they should be protected. Thus the forerunner of institutional psychiatry began. Dr. Samuel Cartwright followed in Bush's footsteps. Again, very renowned in the 1840s, he discovered another major new medical disease peculiar only to Africans, drapetomania, which literally means, quote, flight from home madness, unquote. Dr. Cartwright, writing in several journals at the time and lecturing before esteemed physicians, said that, well, this is what caused slaves to have a desire to run away. The medical intervention would prevent this psychological madness, and the treatment was said to be, quote, whipping the devil out of him, unquote. That's from Cartwright's own writing. Cartwright put on the medical record another, quote, illness, supposedly only unique to Africans, dysphasia athopsis, quote, a mental disease accompanied by physical signs or lesions of the body, discoverable only by a medical observer, unquote. While not a single African visited him with this illness, Cartwright claimed it was prevalent in, quote, only free Negroes, unquote. So if you were a free Negro, you had this disease. If you were a slave, you did not. If you had a desire to run away and become free, you suffered from drapetomania because you had this flight from home madness. And this was then legitimized by an 1840 census, which was later found to be fabricated. The blacks living in the North under the unnatural conditions of freedom, unquote, were more prone to insanity because it was clear that no black could be free and be sane. Politicians took up this false technology, much as they do today with chemotherapy and protease inhibitors for AIDS. We haven't moved very far off this line. And in the 1840s, the former Vice President John C. Calhoun stated, quote, the African is incapable of self-care and sinks into lunacy under the burden of freedom. It is merely a mercy to give him the guardianship and the protection for mental health, unquote. So throughout history, we have had the major leaders in politics, in religion, in medicine, reinforcing over and over again that the African and the African American were inherently diseased, that if they sought freedom or responsible positions, that they were further along in the case of lunacy, and that only a slave could be cured, with psychiatric help, of course. Then let's examine the IQ fraud. During the 1800s, more than 2,000 Americans were enrolled in German universities in which aggressive nationalism and the eugenics catch cry, survival of the fittest, were promoted. By the end of the century, 2 generations of American students returned from Europe believing in German scientific solutions to American problems. There was a California eugenicist. He was very famous. His name was Dr. Paul Popenoe, and from the innocuous-sounding Human Betterment Foundation, authored a study in the 1920s about the, quote, mental status of the so-called colored population in the United States, unquote. He performed an Army IQ test on 18,891 blacks and concluded the IQ of African Americans was dependent upon how much white blood they had in them. The more white blood, he claimed in his scientific papers, which were published in the most respected peer-reviewed journals and held up as examples of the new science, the higher the IQ of intelligence. But how did you get more white blood in the blacks? That produced something of a conundrum here, because blacks and whites were segregated, and yet the only way a black could ever hope to achieve a brighter mind was to have white blood. Quote, it is established that the intelligence of a colored man depends to a marked degree on the amount of white blood he has, unquote. Quote, no amount of education or favorable environment can obviate this condition. The Negro is mentally, therefore eugenically inferior to the white race. All treatment of the Negro in the United States or elsewhere must take into account this fundamental fact, unquote. What does that mean when the most prominent of medical scientists, Dr. Paul Popenoe, from his Human Betterment Foundation, spreads the word insidiously everywhere that blacks can never be made smart? Psychologist Dr. William MacDonald concurred. In 1921, he said that blacks had an instinct to, quote, be submissive, unquote. Therefore, anyone who had a slave was doing the slave a favor. They were never born for leadership. They didn't have the gene. They couldn't be intelligent. They didn't have the brain capacity. Didn't have the IQ. They couldn't be free and be counted upon because, well, they had leprosy. Washington, D.C. psychiatrist Dr. W.M. Bevis also mirrored this when he said, quote, Negro children are bright and full of life, but their mental development starts freezing at puberty. From then on, theirs is a life of sexual promiscuity, gambling, petty thievery, drinking, loafing, etc. That sounds almost like a Republican platform, doesn't it? We haven't gone very far in people thinking about other races. One only has to look at a recent release of Charles Murphy's The Bell Curve to know that psychiatry and psychology's racial justification for keeping African Americans illiterate, unemployed, drug-dependent, and imprisoned is still alive and kicking. Murray and his psychologist puppeteer, Richard Herrnstein, made it clear that they believe African Americans do worse than whites in intelligence tests and are, quote, genetically disabled. Well, what do you do when someone's genetically disabled, when they're not able to help themselves? You do the best thing. You sterilize them. With psychologists and psychiatrists claiming that IQ was congenital, inherited, and thus unchanging, the next step was to sell politicians and others on the idea that African Americans and other minority races were, quote, feeble-minded and therefore a, quote, menace to the race, unquote. Menace to the race. This was in the 1920s. Who else would say another race, the Jewish race, were a menace to the race, or the Aryan race?